My topic tonight is Philippa Foot, in particular her later work on natural goodness. I'm going to be speaking quite a lot also about Michael Thompson, upon whose work Philippa Foot draws extensively in natural goodness. I just wanted to mention that in case you don't know how extensively she uses Thompson's work. It's not that I'm changing topics. I think that they're engaged in a common project. He's a lot more explicit about certain methodological issues that I'll be speaking about tonight. And I'm going to try to give some background about Philippa Foot's project in natural goodness so that if you haven't read the work, hopefully you can understand what I'm going to say about it. So so the central idea of Foot's natural goodness is that moral judgments are of the same logical kind of judgments as those that attribute natural goodness and defect to plants and animals. They're all judgments of natural normativity. These judgments situate a living thing, say a giraffe, against the background of its form of life, the giraffe. A giraffe lacking one or more of its ossicones is a defective giraffe, since under normal circumstances for a giraffe, such a defect will impede it from living its characteristic life. On Foot's view, moral judgments likewise situate individual living human beings against the background of our kind, the human being. But moral judgments focus on a subset of human powers that play a special role in our lives as rational animals, namely reason, will, and desire. These powers play a central role in properly human actions, those actions in which we go for something that we see as good. Through a moral defect, I may be unable to do this. For instance, through weakness of will, I may be sidetracked into doing something that I judge to be bad. These powers, when they are functioning well, are precisely my active powers to be pursuing the good deliberately. And so how I deploy them characterizes me as an agent in a way that my physical talents or defects do not. It would be a mistake to think that in putting moral judgments into the same kind of judgments as judgments of natural goodness and defect in other living things, Foot is offering us a way to resolve moral questions scientifically. Situating our capacities for reason, will, and desire against the background of a human form of life is not like seeing that lacking ossicones is a defect in a giraffe. Whereas we can study how the absence of one or both ossicones affects the ability of a giraffe to live its characteristic life in normal circumstances, we do not obviously get the same sort of guidance by examining the impact of the absence of courage on a human being. Foot herself emphatically denies the goodness of the human will as a matter of biology and asserts that the human good is sui generis. For example, she argues that while sterility is certainly a physical defect in humans and animals alike, the choice not to have children is not ipso facto a defective choice. Many readers of Foot, unfortunately, resolutely ignore what she says about the human good being sui generis and obstinately continue to read her as advocating a biological naturalism. A more textually sensitive objection might question whether, given what she says, she still counts as a naturalist. If the human good is sui generis, as Foot claims, then it does not seem that our nature is playing a substantial role in determining the goodness of our choices. She is not according it a speaking role. This raises the question, if normativity comes apart from our nature, then in what sense is it a naturalistic view? In this paper, I propose a metaphysical response to this question. We can take up Foot's approach as a version of ethical naturalism because we are by nature animals with powers that include reason, will, and desire. These powers are variable in that they can take on further qualities, including virtues and vices. The virtues are perfective of human powers. There's therefore a sense in which the human good is sui generis, and also a sense in which it is an outgrowth of our nature when we take our nature to include powers that can be perfected. On that view, moral virtues perfect our appetitive powers, and morally good acts represent their complete actualization. In making this argument, I'm going beyond Foot's own views. Her Wittgensteinian methodological commitments limit her to offering a conceptual framework or logical grammar for moral judgments, eschewing realist commitments. So her naturalism might be called a logical naturalism. She is content to argue that there is a common logical structure to natural normative judgments in non-humans and moral judgments in the human case. My aim is to advocate for extending Foot's logical naturalism in light of recent defenses of essentialism and the related issue of powers in metaphysics. It is through consideration of this work that we can make a case that the powers, defects, and goodness that we attribute to individual organisms by way of natural historical judgments, including human beings, are a bona fide part of nature and not merely something we posit as an upshot of the mode of representation appropriate for living things. Moreover, on such a view, powers are a part of nature generally, not just human or animate nature. It's just that human powers are distinctively rational. As a result, we get a picture in which there really are forms of life instantiated in individual living things with determinate natures, and that these individuals can be good or defective instances of their kind. So in what follows, I will outline the grammatical and analytic methodology of Foote and Thompson. This method yields a framework that is necessary for speaking intelligibly about living things. Yet it also has some limitations. Nothing in their account gives us a methodology for distinguishing separate powers, including our appetitive powers. To fully appreciate our appetitive powers, I argue that we need to embrace a methodology like that employed by Aquinas in the Treatise on Human Nature and the Commentary on De Anima. We also need to embrace a realistic conception of form and finality. Appreciating the distinctness of our appetitive powers is crucial to properly understanding central aspects of human morality. We must see ourselves as oriented towards particular sensible goods and attempting to bring our orientation towards these goods into line with our idea of what it is to live well. Hence, we must see ourselves as having perfectible, sensitive appetites that can take on qualities that are moral virtues. I conclude by contrasting my realist views on virtue with John McDowell's approach to virtue as second nature, which he offers as a way of filling out Foote's views. McDowell rejects a reading of Aristotle on which the latter is appealing to human nature to underwrite his idea of what it is for a human to live well. Not only does he reject this as a reading of Aristotle, he rejects the idea of constructing standards in ethics out of the facts of nature as bad metaphysics. There may indeed be metaphysics involved in many such attempts, bad metaphysics involved in many such attempts, but with a plausible essentialist view of nature, the project isn't doomed as it seems to McDowell. I will argue that metaphysical assumptions about disenchanted nature as a passive law-governed realm are behind McDowell's rejection of that project. Further, I will argue that we must endorse some neo-Aristotelian metaphysics to fill out the idea, embraced by McDowell, that we can be said to actualize ourselves as animals through the development of virtues compatibly with nature as understood by modern science. Okay, so Foote's methodology. As I mentioned earlier, Foote takes herself to be offering a framework that renders explicit the real logical grammar of moral judgments. Here she's evidently using grammar in Wittgenstein's sense, on which it refers to the logical structure of the appropriate uses of words in various practical contexts, counteracting a philosophical tendency to abstract words from those contexts. It is a central part of Wittgenstein's philosophical methodology to conduct grammatical investigations, which is the exploration of the various ways in which a term is appropriately used, contrasted with artificial philosophical uses of the term in question. Foote takes up this approach herself in her treatment of evaluations in general, and moral judgments in particular. Following Peter Geach, Foote argues that the real logical grammar of goodness belies artificial philosophical treatments of good, such as those found in statements like pleasure is good, wherein the evaluative predicate floats free. Good does not function as a predicative adjective, so such a statement is rarely appropriate, Foote thinks, and it invites fruitless philosophical speculations about non-natural properties or special attitudinizing in non-cognitivist accounts. She writes, judgments of goodness and badness can have, it seems, a special grammar when the subject belongs to a living thing, whether plant, animal, or human being. She thinks that the exploration of that grammar can yield insight into goodness as it is used in moral contexts. In her explication of that grammar, she relies on the work of Michael Thompson, who is much more explicit about his methodological commitments, which he names analytic or Fregean Aristotelianism. Thompson investigates life, action, and practices through analyzing the logical form of thoughts that apprehend each of these objects. Although his investigation has, in his words, something like a metaphysical character, he distinguishes his investigation from a straightforward metaphysical investigation in that the distinctions he draws, for example, between living and non-living, are distinctions among different forms of thought and not drawn directly from the things that are thought about. In the case of living things, he argues that it is a mistake to think that they feature some distinctive properties, such as growth, having DNA, or self-movement. He argues that each of these proposed marks of life is subject to counterexamples, and so builds a case that there isn't any property that distinguishes living from non-living things. Life cannot be given a real definition, on his view. Rather, our talk about living things employs a distinctive categorical framework. If there were a property or set of properties picking out living things from non-living things, a single form of judgment would fully embrace both cases. And what would pick out something as alive would be that certain claims would be true of it that can be formulated in propositions with the same form as that instanced in describing a non-living object. My cat has 4 legs would be much like saying my car is red. But this is not the case, according to Thompson. My thought about my cat employs a distinctive logical form, on his view. I'm not inferring from some set of properties it has to the fact that it's living, but from the first, employing a distinctive categorical framework in order to understand it as alive and to understand my cat as the bearer of 4 legs in the relevant sense. Hence, we find in this domain a different way that the subject of judgments about living things relates to its predicates. For instance, from the fact that cats have 4 legs and this is a cat, it does not follow that this cat has 4 legs. Judgments of living things have a distinctive non-Phrygian form of generality, such that general claims can be true of them despite their not describing even the most statistically common features of that form of life. The subject of what Thompson calls natural historical judgments is something that, in his view, is necessary to the representation of things as alive with this form of generality. The generality attributed to the life form, for example, the domestic house cat, which is then instanced in particular cats, gives it its, the generality is attributed to the life form. For instance, the domestic house cat, which is then instanced, no doubt imperfectly, in the features and activities of particular cats. It follows from this approach that we don't acquire the concept of life and living things from observation and generalization. If there are no empirical properties that distinguish the living from the non-living, then of course we cannot form the concept by induction from instances that bear the appropriate properties contrasted with those that do not. Rather, Thompson believes that there are, and this is a quote, irreducibly diverse but interrelated capacities that find their seat in our intellects, that enable us to grasp different forms of being. Though the content of our thoughts about living things comes from experience, the categories whereby we grasp living things as such are a priori and part of the power of thought itself for Thompson. The concepts that Thompson arrives at to characterize the categorical structure of such thinking, including life form and natural historical judgment, are supplied by reflection on certain possibilities of thought or predication rather than by experience. So they are pure a priori concepts in his view. For Foote's naturalism, Thompson's analysis of the representation of life has the important result that our representation of something as alive features species dependence. This means that any case of representing an individual as an organism requires situating that individual against the background of its kind. The reason this must be so is that in taking something to be alive, we're taking it, at least some of it, the occurrences surrounding it, as non-accidental and agential. If something happens to an organism whereby some matter gets into it and happens to further its metabolic processes, it has not eaten, though perhaps it is nourished. When an animal eats, it takes in something that at least appears to it to be the sort of thing which it derives nutrition for that purpose. It is non-accidental and an active process. To see such a process, we must see it as acting in a way that characterizes something of its kind, and this brings in a normative dimension. Such processes can go awry. Something being a cat is a sufficient explanation for it having 4 legs. The distinctive generality of the natural historical judgment allows for the statement that cats have 4 legs to be true, while we're looking at a cat that has 3 legs. We then register that the cat in front of us has a defect and may wonder how that came about. For these reasons, Thompson thinks that his Davidsonian swamp double, who arises from a lightning bolt and perfectly mimics his actions, is, quote, not so much as alive. Ex hypothesi, what is happening in the swamp double is purely accidental. There's no way for it to be defective in any respect because it does not belong to any kind, instead being a mere congeries of physical particles. Foote and Thompson both argue that this logical structure applies equally to the case of human beings. When we represent human beings and claims about them, we cast ourselves against the background of a form of life, the human being. Yet, as Thompson is especially at pains to emphasize, our relation to this life form is unique in that our relation to it is necessarily not mediated by any observation. Here he draws an analogy between the I concept and the concept human understood as the life form I bear. No observation could establish that the figure in the mirror is me in the absence of an a priori I concept. That is, nothing could bring it about that I connect that image with an image of myself in the absence of such an I concept, because it is no empirical feature or set of features in the image that make it an image of me. I must have such an a priori concept and be able to apply it in a thought such as, I've looked better. Likewise, there are no empirical features of human beings that make them bearers of the life form I bear. Rather, I come into contact with the life form I bear primitively, albeit implicitly, in having thoughts about myself. Thompson describes his line of thought as follows. In the self-conscious representation of myself as thinking, as in all my self-conscious self-representation, I implicitly represent myself as alive, as falling under various life-manifesting types. And in bringing myself under such types, I bring myself under a life form. Self-consciousness is thus always implicitly form consciousness. This distinctive relation that we bear to our own life form is crucial to Foote's naturalism, though she does not emphasize it in her own writings. On Thompson's understanding, we cannot get ourselves into view, describe ourselves, or so much as be aware of ourselves as thinking without situating ourselves as a member of a life form that features some norms. This includes norms concerning what it is to reason and act well. Those norms, whatever they are norms that reveal our conception of what it is to live well qua human. These norms do not come to us from without, from observation, but are embedded in our a priori self-conception that is at the basis of our self-consciousness, according to Thompson. These norms are my norms if anything is mine. Thompson thereby embraces a sort of life form internalism, according to which when we act deliberately and not in weakness of will, we necessarily demonstrate our conception of what it is to live well qua human. On Thompson's view, there are certain features of the life form, human life form, that are incontestable, inasmuch as they are necessary components of a self-conscious form of life. It's instructive to contrast Thompson's methodology as an analytic or Phrygian Aristotelian with the approach to self-knowledge found in Aquinas, who of course also draws on Aristotle. Aquinas writes, "The soul's acts and powers are distinguished by their different objects, only when objects differ qua objects. In terms, Let me start that quote again. The soul's acts and powers are distinguished by their different objects only when the objects differ qua objects, i.e. in terms of the object's formal nature, rationem formalem, as the visible differs from the audible. In cognizing the soul, we must advance from things that are more external, from which the intelligible species are abstracted, through which the intellect cognizes itself. In this way, then, we cognize acts through objects, powers through acts, and the essence of the soul through its powers." This follows a methodological principle from Aristotle to the effect that actualities and actions are prior in account to potentialities. The idea is reasonable because we can only know potentialities, if there are any, through actions, and since potentialities are distinguished through being directed towards their distinctive acts. In Aquinas' methodology, as with Thompson's, we come to know our powers through acts directed at objects, which are differentiated not materially, but formally. In Thompson's methodology, as distinct from Aquinas's, this is carried out in the first instance through the domain within the domain of intellectual judgments, delineating distinctive objects, e.g. living things versus inanimate objects, through analyzing the distinctive forms of thought that apprehend them, arriving at irreducible capacities for thinking about living things that reveal something about the powers of our form of life. Thompson's methodology is necessary for getting at the grammatical forms pertinent to living things and their associated pure concepts. I will assume his claims about these forms are correct. My question is whether Foote and Thompson have an adequate philosophical interpretation of these categories. As I noted before, Thompson counts these concepts as among the irreducibly diverse but interrelated capacities that find their seat in our intellects. The irreducibility of these powers is demonstrated by their purity and irreducibility of the correlative judgments. As Thompson argues in detail, they can't be boiled down to standard Phrygian judgments with ceteris paribus clauses, or to Phrygian judgments with second-order quantification. Given that such judgments are necessary to self-representation, there's a transcendental necessity to the attribution of a power of thought, including the capacity for the representation of living things, on Thompson's view. I can't think of myself as thinking without representing myself as a form of life with the capacity for thought. Hence, I must take myself to be a form of life with at least this power if I'm aware of myself of thinking anything at all. As Thompson himself puts it, this argument has an unwholesome Cartesian flavor. My concern is that this approach imposes a divide between powers that we must take ourselves to have on pains of not being able to represent ourselves as thinking, and powers that we merely represent ourselves as having without such transcendental necessity. There are, after all, acts that we apparently engage in that are not intellectual acts, and these acts seem not to be a function of our cognitive powers alone. For example, we appear to be animals with appetitive powers that target particular material objects as good. Goodness in this sense is traditionally taken to be something that appears to us as an upshot of possessing appetitive powers. For Aquinas, these apparent goods are sufficient grounds for attributing a separate appetitive power. The objects of my sensitive appetites are formally distinct from objects of my intellect or my senses, even when I desire the same object that I also sense and cognize. As Aquinas puts it, the object of both apprehension and appetite is the same in subject, but differs in character, ratione. For it is apprehended insofar as it is sensible or an intelligible being, whereas it is the object of appetite insofar as it's suitable or good. On Aquinas' standard, then, senses, intellect, and appetite are distinct capacities, since their objects are formally distinct. And there are further distinctions to be drawn within each, as the intellect, sense, and appetites all collect further capacities that can be separated on the basis of further formal distinctions among their respective objects. Aquinas' conception of formal nature, of course, extends further than Thompson's because it is not merely logical form. If I see some tofu, say, and it inspires appetite in me, there's a relation between its nature, its form as a piece of tofu, and my own bodily animal nature, my senses and appetites, such that I situate it under the formal nature of goodness and love it, which is the inclination of the appetite toward the possession of the good. Aquinas could see the appetites and passions that correspond to them as powers that are actualized in specific ways through movements that bring them to completion. For Aquinas, these aspects of our nature cannot be grasped without attributing powers to things, including our own bodies. And in so doing, we're attributing to them form and finality. We must take them to be in the thing thought about in virtue of their bodily nature, both in the appetitive animal body and in the desired thing that satisfies those appetites. My complaint is that Thompson's methodology does not, by itself, give us a framework for sorting out claims about powers other than those that are necessary to the capacity for self-consciousness. Aquinas, by contrast, provides such a framework, albeit one that depends on metaphysical claims that Thompson seems unwilling to venture. To illustrate, when I desire a piece of tofu and aim at attaining it, I represent myself as desiring tofu. I must take myself to have powers of thought to so represent myself. Yet, do I take the desiring of tofu to be the result of a power of representation, that is an upshot of my cognitive powers, or part of a separate power? Thompson, on my reading, does not give us an approach to this question. And the question is an important one. Is my excessive desire for tofu a cognitive defect, so that the problem that I'm representing myself in a certain way, is the problem that I'm representing myself in a certain way, or is it a problem with another power? Getting the appetites into view in a way that they can figure as needed in an Aristotelian framework requires this more expansive conception of form and a metaphysical commitment to realism about it. It requires, I think, conceiving the content of our representations of living things as having powers that feature formal and final causation on a physical level, and using these as a basis for distinguishing powers in much the way that Aquinas does in the Treatise on Human Nature. That is in part a matter of translating the features that Thompson finds on the logical level of representation back into the physical world. Thompson finds concepts including organism, organ, vital operation, and life form, which he collectively terms vital categories, to be irreducible logical categories. My claim is that they are not only that, and stopping there with laying out a categorical framework for living things would leave us with an incomplete self-understanding. Thompson's restrictions appear to issue from a worry about embracing an egregious organicist metaphysics, and a view that the inanimate physical world is to be understood as a realm of law and passive matter. Yet this picture of nature is increasingly under challenge from those committed to essentialist accounts of the physical world, on which there are kinds with dispositions to act in certain ways that define their intrinsic natures, and these are their causal powers. It's crucial to frame this issue in a way that brings Thompson's categorical framework into contact with the metaphysical claims in order to make headway. Recent work in Aristotelian metaphysics has treated life in a way that does not integrate Thompson's categorical framework. For example, Edward Fazer and David Oderberg defend a scholastic conception of life on which it is defined by immanent causation. This is causation that originates within an agent and terminates in that agent for the sake of its self-perfection. Nutrition here would be a paradigmatic case of immanent causation. An organism photosynthesizes or eats for the sake of maintaining its form, that is, for the sake of self-perfection. This is to be contrasted with transient causation, which is causation that terminates in something other than the origin of the cause, one rock knocking another off the cliff, for example. Thompson's argument shows that this definition does not stand on its own. That is because the notion of self-perfection contains a reflexive term, and as Thompson points out, the whole problem is already contained in the reflexive. That is, the reflexive conceals an assumption concerning the relevant entity that is to perfect itself. Consider Thompson's parallel case concerning self-movement, another mark of the living. He contrasts a bird flying out of a stadium of its own accord versus a bird that has been mistaken for a fastball and is flying out of the stadium having been struck by a bat. Which one is self-movement? Intuitively, it is the first, but as Thompson points out, if A moves B, then the mereological sum of A and B in some sense moves itself, or some of itself. In other words, the batter and the bird together form a self-moving system. The determination of the relevant entity, the organism, depends on establishing the natural historical judgments against the background of which we can pick out a living thing as such and attribute flight to that thing. Thompson would therefore deny that we can pick out living things as individual material objects distinguished from inanimate objects through possessing a property or mark of engaging in self-perfective acts. We must have recourse to a life form, as captured by natural historical judgments, in order to pick out an individual living thing and to see what happens in it as self-perfective action. My suggestion then is that human beings are a distinctive sort of living thing with specific causal powers, that is, distinctive self-perfective powers. We require Thompson's categorical framework to get ourselves into view as living things. Within that framework, we need, in addition, something like Thompson's criterion to get our individual properties properly into view. So let's look a little bit more carefully at our appetitive powers. Awareness of oneself as having a desire is a deployment of the sort of form consciousness discussed before. To understand myself as having a desire, I must understand myself as a living thing. As Thompson said, as Anscombe says, a primitive sign of wanting is trying to get. A little before that, she says, this is from Intention, one cannot describe a creature as having a power of sensation without also describing it as doing things in accordance with perceived sensible differences. These remarks situate a living thing against a wider context, which represents it as having sensory and appetitive powers. In my own case, my awareness of wanting something situates me under a certain kind with such capacities. Wanting and trying to get things are things that situate, wanting and trying to get things are, are things that characterize this form, even if my particular wants are rather idiosyncratic. Part of my form consciousness is pure, on Thompson's view. I must have a pure conception of a living thing, he believes, and of the concept, the life form I bear. As with recognizing one's image in the mirror, a self-conscious desire is immediately attached to an I concept. I don't observe a desire and then attach it to myself, but rather my desire involves me and directs me, in the case of what Thomas Aquinas terms sensitive appetites, to something in my sensory field or imagination. So part of what I'm aware of in desiring something is the pure form consciousness that frames my form of life as something with a capacity for wanting and trying to get. On the Thomistic view that I'm advocating, we should understand our sensitive appetites as the function of a power separate from our powers of representation. That is because the objects of those acts concern differs formally. The intellect's powers culminate in an act of cognition that abstracts from the particularity of the object of my cognition, and the psychological particularities of the current grasp of the object of my cognition. It is something I can repeat under different circumstances, faced with different particulars that fall under the same universals, grasped under different psychological conditions. It is repeated by others in different bodies with different psychological contexts. In other words, sensed particulars might occasion an episode of cognition, and it occurs in a particular embodied rational animal, but the cognitive act aims at something that goes beyond these particulars. By contrast, my hunger is sated by some particular bit of matter that I sense, ultimately being subsumed into my form, not by mere apprehension or cognitive appreciation of the tofu's form. My appetites therefore relate me as a concrete particular to other concrete particulars as such. Indeed, it relates me to some of them as goods. The appetites in question are sensitive appetites in that they follow sensing something. Our bodies respond to what we perceive through the senses. There's a physical change in us that responds to the perception of something desired or to some threat to something desired. These changes initiated in us through sense apprehension, Aquinas labels the passions. Though they begin passively in apprehension, each passion is the active bodily course of an appetite playing out in relation to a particular apprehended object, inciting that appetite. The appetites relate to sensed particulars in a distinctive way, as goods. The appetites are a power to go for the good as it is manifest in the sensible world. All of this occurs in an individual organism against the background of natural historical judgments that pick out an individual organism with powers of sensation and appetite that define natural norms for an organism of that sort. If I have a nagging appetite for what I know to be motor oil, there's clearly something defective about my appetites. Of course, the desire may persist in the light of the recognition that it is leading me to something that is not genuinely good. Desires can thereby manifest in various ways. I can be plagued by an unwelcome desire, or I can identify with desires as leading me to something genuinely good. And this is part of the form consciousness that is necessary for self-consciousness. Those desires that come unwelcome are represented as defective in the sense of being something not directed to a genuine human good. Most of us probably have some desires that show up in this way. These desires are desires that we wish to be rid of, and we can undertake to do so through resolve and repeatedly acting against the promptings of these desires. In so acting, we aim to transform the appetites, positing that they can take on different qualities. These qualities are the subject matter of virtue ethics. They are the hexes, or habitus. In undertaking to bring our appetites into accord with the conception of the good, our picture of the proper human life, we're positing that the appetites can take on these different qualities, virtues and vices. Our attempts to transform our appetites imply that we take these appetites to be variable causal powers, to use Brian Ellis's terminology. More specifically, it implies that I take it that my appetites might be shaped through reason to acquire states that are a function of my choices. This is a core thesis of Aristotelian virtue theory. My appetites can be brought under a principle through my choices. In Aquinas' terminology, the habitus that are the moral virtues are principles of the movement of the sense appetites. Developing such a principle is a distinctive sort of change that belongs uniquely to the appetitive powers of a rational animal. There are other changes that my appetites can undergo that are oblique to these changes. My appetites can grow or diminish with age and health. From one day to the next, I might have a taste for fish, tofu, or leafy greens, all of which are wholesome and preserve good condition in moderate amounts. To introduce a distinction from Aristotle, these changes in my appetitive powers are merely alterations. But the change that occurs in bringing my appetites into accord with a principle that embodies my conception of the good is something I will conceive as a perfection. It is indeed a perfection if my conception of the good is correct. In my view, this interpretation of our form of life involves registering and attributing to it a distinct power. There's a bit of metaphysics here. It goes beyond pure form consciousness and offers a metaphysical interpretation of that form consciousness that posits appetites as a distinct power belonging to me as a human being, but distinct from my intellect. It's difficult to see how we can avoid such a self-interpretation. As Aquinas points out, the appetites contribute something of their own. This is their independent capacity to grasp and present particular sense things as good. Reason cannot, on its own, relate to particular sensed objects as good. That is, there would be no reason to go for anything sensed apart from an appetite for it. Reason can, however, take an independent stand on what the appetites present to it as good or bad. Thus, the appetites clash with reason as a result of our sensing or imagining something pleasant that reason forbids, or something unpleasant that reason demands. These are everyday phenomena that support the Aristotelian interpretation that there is a distinct appetitive power. That this power is perfectible is likewise a seemingly inevitable part of our interpretation of human form. Take the example of Mary from Julia Anas's Virtue Ethics and Social Psychology. Mary treats her colleagues respectively, but humiliates waiters in restaurants, yells at her son's soccer coach, and is rude to shop owners. Let us say that Mary recognizes that her behavior in restaurants, shops, and the soccer field is bad and aims to get better. If Mary is to get so far as to be continent with respect to her irascible behavior in these contexts, this must surely require a transformation of the appetites. If acting considerately in all those contexts is indeed part of her conception of the good, she must regard her inclinations to the contrary as foreign intrusions that she would undertake to rid herself of. She must aim to bring her appetites into conformity with her conception of how it is best to live. To suggest that this is impossible or rare, as some philosophical situationists do, is to embrace a significant limitation on our moral agency. We cannot hope to ever fully desire what we claim to think of as good. But this isn't just a limitation on our desires. It is also a sort of cognitive limitation, a limitation on our ability to relate to the good as presented in the particulars of our existence through bringing appetites and reason into accord. Mary could have a cognitive grasp on the importance of showing compassion to others, and yet not have the ability to desire to treat her waiter with compassion. For that reason, she would not be able to appreciate the particular goodness of that act of compassion, even if through self-control she's able to bring it about that she acts in conformity with a rule. Of course, Mary may end up saddled with recalcitrant desires, but it is crucial for her to undertake to change her appetites, and there are reasons to see this as a process that takes time. As Aquinas points out, habitus change in rational animals requires more than one act. He writes, "Reason, which is an active principle, cannot wholly dominate the appetitive power in one act. For the appetitive power is inclined in different ways and to many things, whereas reason judges in a single act that this should be willed for these reasons and in these circumstances. Consequently, the appetitive power is not all at once wholly controlled so as to be inclined like nature to the same thing for the most part, which is proper to a habitus of virtue." So the nature of the appetitive power is such that it cannot be determined all at once to what is good as discerned by reason. It takes time to perfect one's appetites, and no definite amount of time can be specified. Hence, Mary should not all at once resign herself to her recalcitrance if the appetites prove obstinate to change. Instead, she must continue to act on right reason, hoping her desires will come into alignment with her choices over time. For it is through acts that we change our appetites. On Aquinas' view, reason, as the active component of the soul, acts on the appetites as a passive component, producing a quality. As Aquinas puts it, the habitus of virtue is produced in the appetitive powers as they are moved by reason. Hence, it is not a distinct process that Mary would have to undertake to change her appetites, but rather a persistence in acting against the contrary desires so as to bring about, eventually, appetites in conformity with her conception of the good. So, on the basis of these mundane but crucial features of our moral experience, I'm arguing for a more metaphysically robust interpretation of human form than Foote or Thompson avow. Virtues are perfections of our appetitive powers, and so these powers are, in an important sense, naturally directed to morally good acts. Those acts are the completion of the appetites as the sort of thing they are. They perfectly actualize them in that they are the attainment of what they are powers to do. Yet, as a power that is rational by participation, there's another sense in which this does not happen naturally. For our appetites to attain their perfection, they must take on qualities that come from reason, and so are not there simply as a matter of course. Rather, they require exercises of rational agency to be developed. This can make it seem as though reason is setting standards quite independently of our so-called first nature. Foote describes virtues as consisting of A, the recognition of a particular consideration as reasons for acting, and B, the relevant action. But which considerations should count? Those that make the will good, which on Foote's view includes the sorts of consideration that are taken into account by agents who possess justice, courage, temperance, and charity, among others. As Michael Thompson interprets Foote, she does not want to justify these claims, but rather takes them to be self-validating. As he writes, the human form of life is one in which considerations of justice, for example, characterize sound practical reason, but this is not something we properly discover from close study of human life. That we operate with these thoughts is thus a part of what makes these thoughts true. Let's call this the strongly sui generis reading of the human good. It's an understanding of the project of naturalism that one can find in John McDowell, Thompson, and Foote on Thompson's interpretation. By contrast, I want to argue that the study of human life does yield substantive results. There seems to be some evidence that Foote herself thought along these lines, contra Thompson's reading of her, as when she says things like, the evaluation of the human will should be determined by facts about the nature of human beings and the life of our own species. The view that I'm advocating might be called a weakly sui generis reading, in that I hold that there are distinctive standards that apply to human beings qua rational animals, and yet essential features of human beings as rational animals, including our appetitive powers, determine what it is for us to be good. Part of the reason this latter interpretation of Foote's project may not seem open is due to blinkered metaphysics. If we can't think of finality in nature, then we can't think of our desires as having an independent finality, that is, a finality independent of aims that we deliberately take up. One could think that appetites take on finality only through being integrated into intentional actions, but I want to say that appetites have their own completion as a separate power, and that their completion is essential to human excellence. That completion occurs when the appetites take on the virtues as principles of their movement, and then achieve their aim in morally good acts. We can, of course, act contrary to the finality of our appetites. For example, we can deliberate poorly about what constitutes the fulfillment of our appetites. Yet I would like to say, for example, that there is such a thing as temperance that holds across humankind. It is, of course, contextually sensitive, such that there's a certain amount of water, small amount of water, to drink on an expedition, is appropriate to drink on an expedition to the Sahara, and another larger amount among the abundant freshwater lakes of Canada. But the contextually appropriate mean, however much water that is the proper fulfillment of human appetites. It may be up to reason to determine what the mean is, but it is not up to reason to determine that whatever the mean is, that is the end of our appetites. In affirming this, I'm advisedly taking up a position that not very long ago was taken to be obviously out of bounds. Bernard Williams, to take one famous example, railed against the idea of an inner nisus toward virtue in his 1986 Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. Yet, even sometime before Williams wrote dismissively of these views, powers and finality were enjoying a revival in metaphysics and philosophy of science. As far back as 1970, Ram Hare argued that there is nothing occult about the idea of powers, and that they are in fact central to an adequate epistemology of science. To ascribe a power to something is to tell us what it will do because of its intrinsic nature. Moliere's mockery of the virtue stormativa is undeserved. Instead of a fatuous pseudo-explanation that it is supposed to be, it is in fact something substantive. That the sleepiness observed after the ingestion of opium is to be attributed to the intrinsic nature of opium. This claim leads us to further scientific investigation of what it is about the constitution of opium that gives it this power. Further, on the view of some power theorists, including Edward Fazer and David Oderberg, powers capture aspects of causality that cannot be captured by a counterfactual analysis. Powers capture what causality is rather than its consequences. Oderberg argues that in order to account for efficient causality, we must make an appeal to finality. He writes, final causes are the precondition of the very possibility of any efficient causality. If fire burns wood but not pure water, if beta particles can penetrate a sheet of paper but not a sheet of lead, this can only be because agents are ordered to some effects rather than others. They each have their own finality, which restricts the range of effects, while still having various kinds and degrees of indifference within that range. In other words, effects are a function of the nature of things involved in causal interaction, and their powers are due to their constitution. Nancy Cartwright argues that powers and capacities make better sense of the methods of the sciences, than human approaches. We proceed scientifically, she thinks, by attributing powers to things, positing that these powers are behind the effects that we witness. Hence, there are reasons from both philosophy, metaphysics and philosophy of science to affirm the existence of powers in nature, and no reason to hold the prejudice Williams and others harbor toward the view. All I mean to do here is to suggest that this prejudice is unwarranted and to point to a potentially fruitful collaboration between Neo-Aristotelian metaphysics and Neo-Aristotelian ethics. Specifically, taking our departure from this essentialist view of nature for developing a Neo-Aristotelian ethical naturalism allows us to postulate that virtues perfect our first nature and reject the strongly sui generis reading of the human good in favor of the weakly sui generis view. For the sake of contrast, take John McDowell's understanding of Aristotle. On McDowell's view, Aristotle conceives of ethics as an autonomous set of rational requirements that result from an upbringing that imparts an ethical outlook, an upbringing that gets us to see that certain considerations as reasons for action. This Bildung, as McDowell styles it, imparts a second nature, operating within the realm of law, yet not determined by its standards. Whereas nature controls the behavior of non-rational animals, the acquisition of a second nature frees us to answer to demands that are not given by nature and to step back from any motivational impulse one finds oneself subject to question its rational credentials. Through this reshaping of our motivational impulse, we ourselves acquire freedom vis-a-vis the demands of nature, and our motivational responses are reshaped in accordance with what we rationally affirm. What is initially a passive contingent upshot of our biological nature becomes, as a result of Bildung, a reflection of a conception of living well qua human being. Our desires thereby reflect our spontaneity as rational beings rather than our passive determination as natural beings. McDowell rejects a reading of Aristotle according to which his aim is to construct requirements of ethics out of independent facts about human nature. He casts this reading of Aristotle as an historical monstrosity because it attributes to Aristotle an anxiety about the status of reasons to which he was immune because he lacked the modern conception of nature as a realm of law. What's bizarre about McDowell's argument is that if Aristotle's understanding of nature is not that of a realm of law, then what constructing the requirements of ethics out of independent facts about human nature would mean for him would also be quite a different thing than it means to someone pursuing such a project today in light of a Humean conception of nature. So what McDowell must mean is that those readings of Aristotle, he cites Williams, take him to be doing something that we obviously cannot do because we reject his conception of nature. McDowell wants to save Aristotle from doing something that would be cogent given his understanding of nature, but not ours. If this is correct, the anachronism may be McDowell's. He's trying to defend Aristotle from criticism for a project that he doesn't undertake, squaring ethics with nature conceived as a realm of law. Instead, Aristotle's project may indeed be that of squaring the requirements of ethics with nature, not as a passively obedient realm of law, but as a realm of active powers, which is the project that I want to defend in our contemporary context. It's worth pointing out that features of McDowell's account are rendered either incoherent or trivial given his strongly sui generis stance on the human good. McDowell says that the educational process of building is an element in the normal coming to maturity of the kind of animal we are. Building actualizes some of the potentialities we are born with. Our mode of living is our way of actualizing ourselves as animals, and exercises of spontaneity belong to our way of actualizing ourselves as animals. Those are all quotes from Mind and World. What does such talk mean in the absence of a conception of nature as containing powers that stand to be actualized? These claims are all made from the standpoint of someone who has acquired the relevant upbringing. Perhaps it is a matter of using our traditional philosophical vocabulary to shower praise on what one has been brought up to praise. They simply mean our mode of living is good according to our mode of living. If they're supposed to mean something more than this, then it raises the important question of how these supposed potentialities we possess are part of the realm of law, which is exactly the sort of question McDowell invokes the idea of second nature in hopes of silencing. In light of an essentialist conception of nature, we can instead take these claims to be straightforwardly true. Virtue perfects us as the kind of thing we are by perfecting the powers that are essential to us as rational beings. Placing virtue within nature in this way bridges the gulf between second nature and first nature in a more straightforward way. Instead of attempting to shut down the questioning as misplaced, this program offers a promise of a direct answer. As Brian Ellis states, The power of agency is not something unique to human beings or other living creatures. It is a pervasive feature of reality. This is not to say that human agency is not something rather special. It clearly is. On the other hand, it is not as alien to the essentialist view of the world as it is to the Humean one. As Ellis sees it, the essentialist conception of nature has the potential to bring the manifest and scientific images together by showing that human rational powers are in many ways like the powers we find elsewhere in nature. That is, like powers in inanimate things, human rational and appetitive powers have intrinsic features that dispose them to realize themselves in characteristic ways. Unlike inanimate powers, and even variable causal powers of complex systems, human rational powers are also meta-powers, powers to change their own dispositional properties. Of course, understanding those sorts of powers would be a central question as part of a productive collaboration between Aristotelian metaphysics and Aristotelian ethical theory. Yet, if I'm right, this is the direction that we need to go in order to fund a full-blooded, realist ethical naturalism. We should see the human good as a matter of perfecting appetitive and intellectual powers that we really have. The perfection of the appetites consists in taking on qualities whereby they respond to our environment in ways that exhibit a principle of reason. They reflect our conception of the good as they reach out to sensible particulars. The human appetites are by nature aimed at morally good acts and find their ultimate fulfillment therein. When we acquire virtue, we're acquiring states that allow us to fully realize our nature. In making this argument, I take myself, again, to be going beyond the Wittgensteinian grammatical projects started by Foote or the Fregean Aristotelianism of Thompson, but in a way that is very much indebted to their project. The point I'm making is that their vital ethical categories need supplementation with a new essentialist metaphysics that bridges our moral judgments into a natural world inhabited by rational animals. Thank you.